Today's episode is sponsored by Ellie, Ellii.
Ellie is one of the world's leading content libraries for English language teachers, with thousands of ready-made lessons and flashcards and hundreds of videos that you can use to complement your own curriculum or use as your main source of materials.
Ellie is run by a team of former English teachers, dedicated to creating content that engages your language learners.
If you're an independent teacher or paying for your materials out of pocket, we invite you to use our podcast's exclusive discount code Think-Aloud to save 15% off your first membership term. That's THINKALOUD.
And if you're an administrator looking to buy for your whole program, just reach out to the fine folks at Ellie to inquire about a 2-month free trial to test it out for your organization. And don't forget to mention who sent you, your friends at the Teacher Think Aloud podcast.
Head to ellie.com today. That's ELLII.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shay.
And I'm Anna.
Anna, have you ever scrolled through job postings and seen native English speakers only? And then thought, wait, what?
Right? As if a passport determines teaching ability.
Exactly. Well, the reality is, ELT has a long history of prioritizing where you're from over what you know. But in a world where most English speakers aren't from countries like the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, why is this still the standard?
And it's not just about hiring practices. It's in our course books, our pronunciation models, even in the way we talk about quote unquote good English.
So in this episode, we're unpacking native speakerism in ELT. We're diving into why some schools still prefer native teachers, even when their qualifications say otherwise.
We'll also look at how pronunciation myths hold learners and teachers back.
And of course, what we as educators can do to challenge this bias.
And trust us, our guest, Meri, has plenty to say about it.
Let's meet her.
Okay, so thank you for having me. My name is Meri Maroutian. You can refer to me as she, her. And currently I'm freelancing, but I used to have any kind of role in English language teaching. So primary, secondary, adult students, young learners, you name it, I've done it. And I refer to myself as a non-native speaker with this derogatory kind of term to address the biases that are present currently in the English language teaching industry, which favors obviously native speaker teachers. And so I went into my profession as an English language teacher in a very random way because I got contacted by a school who wanted me to go and teach English. And I told them I was not qualified to do the job. They had contacted me through some people that they knew, an ad that they had seen. And just over like a phone call conversation, they said, would you like to teach for us? And I said, well, I'm not a teacher, but they didn't mind because I was perceived as a native speaker, which is kind of like a paradox considering where we are today. Yeah.
That's a really interesting origin story.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So when I I taught business English, and for like a year, I was trying to kind of make enough money to invest in a course. So I would do this because I really liked the job. But I was totally like unaware of anything about the job. I realized that. And I had a colleague of mine who was the only one who had a CELTA. And I was like, yeah, I want to get that so I know what I'm doing here. And after a year and a half, I went to Seville. I did my CELTA. And I really enjoyed it. I really loved it. And I really wanted to do the Delta afterwards. And after like two and a half years working constantly, I never stopped. I was 23 when I started, by the way. I did the Delta in 2018, and then I did an MA in languages and culture and literature and all that. So I really wanted to climb the career ladder and get all the knowledge and know-how for doing a job well done. But I never actually considered, which is very funny, we're talking about native speakerism in general, I had never considered that it was a problem in the English language teaching industry until like maybe 4 or 5 years into the profession. I never even noticed.
Well, more on that in a moment. We said that we would have a surprise icebreaker question, and you said that you listened to one of our episodes. So this is actually inspired by something you said just before we started recording. And also, I saw one of your recent very funny reels on Instagram. I'm wondering, how long have you been playing piano and or singing?
That's like when people try to find some dirt on me online, they find my YouTube videos where I'm singing like, oh, you're a singer. Like, yeah, I'm not ashamed to say it's not really something I do professionally, I would say. I just studied like how to play a little bit, accompany myself while I sing, because I'm more of a singer than a pianist. So I would say I started when I was about 17, 18. I did 2 years of that, but it was really more to help me with my singing. Still do sing. I used to gig, but now I don't anymore. I don't have the time for that, but probably I'll go back to that.
That's lovely. Multi-talented.
Thank you.
Now you get a second icebreaker question. Now that you said that you live the gig life a little bit, what was a special gig that you did back in the day?
Oh, well, I used to sing the blues. I had a blues band. So we kind of tour a little. We did like, I would say the highlight of it all would be like a blues challenge contest that we did as a band. And I think we placed fifth.
Wow, that's super cool. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to say, Shay also has a lovely singing voice, so you could connect on that for a while.
It's been a long time since I've
You have videos
sung
on
in
YouTube?
public. No, I don't. Fortunately, all of my public singing stopped before YouTube really became a thing, so there's not much documentation out there, for better or worse. Maybe on like my mom's old camcorder or something in their basement. Yeah. Well, anyway, okay. Well, so Meri, you've already started to use the phrase native speakerism. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with this term, can you share with us what native speakerism is within ELT and how it impacts both ELT professionals and learners? And where did this fixation on native speakers come from, you think?
Well, I think it has always existed in a way, because we've only had this term, it was introduced by Adrian Holiday, but it was all about like seeing native speakers as though they were the perfect models and better teachers, inherently better at language in general. And so this has been going on since colonialism, since imperialism. And so it's like a fixation that is rooted in the colonial history of English. And it has made itself very present also in the methodologies that we are currently still using, because it always has this sort of a native speaker ideal that is rooted inside our way of doing things. And even though with the years and with the current practices, we know this to not reflect the reality. So we just often speak about global Englishes. We often talk about non-native teachers being present and intelligibility being a priority and whatnot. Like in 2001, if you think about the CFR descriptors, they've changed since then to not include this terminology of the native speaker ideal, or to, the maximum requirement for a learner would be like that native speakers would understand them and they would understand native speakers up until 2001. So that has been taken out and modified, and still what we see today in course book materials, in curriculum design, and it's still there. There's only like 1 or 2 models of English that teachers and students follow and look up to. So
Yeah, we've been thinking about this a lot as we're preparing for the TESOL International Conference, thinking about, the prevalence of global English and different versions of English and how we need to be highlighting them more. And I'm thinking about sort of these ideals, or what has been historically thought of as ideal forms of English that we're really using. And there's a specific term for it that's sort of, it's eluding me right now.
The term that was eluding her listeners was prestige models. That is the form of English that's most commonly been taught. American English and British English primarily.
I think that we are sort of starting to see some changes in literature, and certainly people like you in positions of thought leadership who are are moving things along. Tell us a little bit more about the impact that native speakerism within ELT has on professionals and on learners.
Well, there's so much to speak about, but I feel like the first place to start there would be hiring practices, because I think that's the first place where people start to realize that there is this repetition of native speakers only, native speaker only, and then it goes into like passport, nationality, and these kind of requirements. Which again, if you go into the legal aspect of things, you know that the European Union, I reside in Italy, bans that. So they are totally against that. It's prohibited. However, it doesn't stop schools, institutions, advertising for native speaker only jobs. And when non-native English speaking teachers call it out and say it as it is, then it's like, why are we still talking about the issue? So there's a lot of gatekeeping within the profession with native speaker teachers, I feel, who are trying to, it's not something personal, but it seems to most native speakers that it is, even though there are a lot of allies, there are a lot of native speakers who agree with what non-native teachers are saying and calling out and saying that this is a malpractice. It's kind of a vicious circle. And I think that the worst part of it all is that it tends to become like a fight between, or like a little verbal, sort of who is a better teacher, and you made this punctuation. Like when teachers try to connect or speak about something, it becomes a discourse on things that don't really matter and don't move us forward. Because then what happens is that the marginalized group starts to become the oppressor in a way. And so it's like, we know better, we studied this. And we lose our objective in the first place, because it's not about this social construct. It's not about the dichotomy of native speakers and non-native speakers, because this is just an idea. It's an ideology, right? So we shouldn't be looking at the perception. We should be actually aiming for qualified teachers entering the profession, and not just based on what passport and what nationality these people have.
I have so many thoughts that I couldn't keep up with my notes. You mentioned credentials. I appreciate that you started this conversation with an emphasis on the importance that you put on going and seeking out your credentials. We did an episode a long time ago talking about the backpacker teacher and importance of formal education, and you mentioned your master's degree, and couldn't agree more on that, because often the lack of credential is just facilitated by that native speaker prestige.
A lot of people, and I feel this is something that I'm really thinking about more recently, because the minimum requirement is seen as the gold standard for most. And people really throw around the word qualified. They really throw it around as if it were nothing. It's like people are comparing a CELTA, which is a great course. I don't want to downplay it. I loved doing the CELTA, and I think that it's a great initial training for teachers, and you can definitely get ahead in the game and have a career. Personally, what really triggers me is that I could have stopped there and nothing would have changed in my career, which is what makes me disappointed, I guess, in academia, because I used to believe, and I still do, like that, knowledge and learning about things is really important. You need to be moving forward, etc. But I don't see that legitimized in real life. I feel like lately the conversations I've also been having on social media or on LinkedIn is like, oh yeah, you bookworms, just go and read up. We're in education, and people are now making fun of people who educate themselves to better serve their clients. And going back to that now, non-native teachers have to legitimize themselves, because we already have the internalized belief of not being as good as, because for a century we've been told we're not enough, we're not good enough. And our learners are hearing that as well. So students, clients, but we are also in the game as non-native teachers. We are victims of this kind of narrative and negative myth that has been perpetuated for so many years that we actually think that of ourselves, that we are not good enough. And if you look at non-native teachers, very few of them, like I was one of them who was perceived as a native speaker and got the job. But for many non-native teachers, this is not even an option. You don't get a foot in the door unless you have like the maximum. And still, like there will be someone overtaking you because they have the minimum requirement. And you can't say anything because they'll say, I'm qualified. Well, let's look at this qualification. If we are to say that this is okay for you to be, getting a job or we should be doing the same job, but you're getting paid more and I'm getting paid less for the same job. Whereas, if we look at things from a global perspective, like you have a 120-hour course that you've completed in a month, and I have 10,000 hours of studying.
Right. Big difference.
And you are telling me you are qualified.
Yeah.
Mary, I'm thinking, earlier you mentioned like there's a little bit of a conflict between, native English speakers, non-native English speakers, with native English speakers maybe wanting to dismiss the idea that there are any barriers for non-native English teachers. And, when you mentioned hiring practice, I work for Bridge Education Group and we do corporate language training. We hire primarily multilingual teachers, and we call them that, multilingual teachers. That's, intentional. And we have teachers from more than 40 different countries, and we lead with that. But we're just one organization. That doesn't mean that the work is done. Not everyone is following suit. And then we also have to talk about the compensation of, these different organizations and people with their different credentials and backgrounds. So I wanted to highlight that stuck with me. I think that there's so much more work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that, the culprit being awareness. People think that when they are aware of the disparity, then the job is done. Not even half done, like it's done. We know this exists. And so let's just move on. And people always say, they compliment me on, wow, you're so passionate about this. There's such an energy about it. When you live it on a daily basis, like I get, oh, could you maybe give some, can you tutor my son since you're a native speaker? I'd love to. I'm not a native speaker. I keep having these conversations. I talk to my son. They hear me in English. Is his dad English? Okay, everywhere I turn, this is haunting me. And I do take the time to explain to anyone who would listen what this is about, because it's not okay. And if I can change one person's mentality about this and get someone hire someone to say the right thing in the right place, I'm all for it. Because I don't know, maybe in 10 years, I will, I see a lot of people have given up, even people who were, I don't want to name names, who were like the leaders in this field of, we're going to fight this battle. They're not talking about it anymore. I think it really tires. It's draining to have to go through so much. Just today, a person on Instagram texted me saying, look at the message that I got. And it was about a learner who said, oh, I won't need you to be following me. I found a native speaker teacher who can actually come to my house. And she was like, how disrespectful is this? Like, not only are you telling me you won't be contacting me for my services, but you actually are going with a random person. And, and she told me, and she was aware of it, but she said, I didn't have the energy right there. And then I was so offended. It was so offensive to me and the work that I put in. To hear that, I really didn't know where to start the conversation. And so I just couldn't. I totally get it, because it's so hurtful, isn't it? Yeah. Just imagine.
Absolutely. I can't even imagine, actually. That would hurt so much. I mean, because it's so personal. It's completely outside of your control. What language, what culture you were born to, and that's the deciding factor, and someone would tell you to your face. But also, I think the issue is that people don't tell you to your face, but it's still there, and it's still often the reasoning. And so I want to go back to this concept of awareness that you brought up being the first step. And of course, the second step is taking action, and we'll get to that next. But thinking of the unconscious bias or conscious bias, but often it is an unconscious bias. And I think you're really good at highlighting what some of those biases are. Can you tell us what places native speaker bias turns up? I mean, you've talked about hiring practices. This example is evidence of that. But where are some places within hiring and elsewhere that you see evidence of native speakerism in ELT?
Well, it's everywhere, really. The more you look, the more you are surprised to find it there. Personally, when I was teaching alongside an English native speaker, who totally, again, was aware of it. And though it was the first conversation I had with my colleague on this, by the way. Then I realized that, first of all, she told me I have native speaker on my CV because my last name is Italian. She had married an Italian, obviously. And she was like, I knew that if they saw that, I wouldn't get hired. So conscious, unconscious. She was very well aware of what she was doing. She knew that it was wrong, but she was playing.
It's a game.
It's a game. I don't blame individuals. Again, I don't blame it because if you know you can get far ahead in it, it's the system. That's why I talk about systemic bias that we need to be fighting, not individuals. Because if I know that if I put that name or if I say that thing or if I put that nationality, I'm going to get ahead in life, wouldn't you? It's allowed. I had another person, because again, on social media, people tend to talk a lot about these things, who said to me that they do this themselves, but they kind of justify it from a variety, of kind of angles of this is fine for some people, this is not fine. Well, what if it's wrong on so many different levels, but if you can exploit it, why not? It's a privilege that you can play up. One of the followers actually said to me that she was in a hiring position for once, and she saw someone do that. She said, "You know what I did? I put it straight in the bin." And I was like, I'm glad that you're in a hiring position. Where did you actually see what qualifications the person had? Because we're doing the same thing. If I see a native speaker, okay, and I see that on their CV, maybe that's that they're trying to get ahead in the game, but maybe they're qualified. And they might not know who's on the other end reading that email or reading that CV, right? So they're sending in a resume thinking, okay, someone's going to hire me because of this, maybe because of this, or maybe because of that, who knows? And so my suggestion there was like, do you want me to draft an answer for you that you could maybe reply back with and say, you shouldn't put that on your CV. I value, your time, but they know why they have been refused. Because if you put something in the bin just because out of, rage, out of this is not fair, and why are you using that privilege? You're doing the same thing. So it's about letting people know that this is not okay. It's not about discriminating and being the oppressor, because now you're in a position of power to do the same thing that was done to you. So it's not fight fire with fire.
Yeah.
It's saying, we're not accepting you, and this is why we're not accepting you. We don't value people who don't have the integrity to send us something and base it on, because native speaker is not a qualification, native speaker is not a skill, and we do not value people who are trying to play the system this way. Okay.
Yeah.
Or maybe how about redraft your CV, send it back to us, and we'll see, because this is not to standard. We don't.
Yeah, I like that calling out. Yeah. Privately.
I'm smiling so big right now because I love that quote you just shared, Mary. Being a native speaker is not a qualification. I'm with you. Yeah, I love that.
Nothing.
Yep.
Yeah, I just had a reel go viral, and it's about accent bias, about someone saying, the London accent. She's a black lady with a London accent, obviously, and she lives in Los Angeles. And she says, people, when I speak British English, they don't get it because they don't associate one thing and the other. And then I can't say, I have to say water so people understand me instead of using my own accent. And the comments, I can't even begin. And just one lady just said, yeah, because English belongs to the English. Why should we?
That's the wrong message.
Let's go back again to history lesson. Again, you need to educate people as to what languages are, why they are being used, why English is a global language. And it's a long battle. But what is worse is when teachers have that conversation, because they should know better. And this is where I get angry.
Yeah, no, I'm angry now, Mary. I'm thinking about, like when we're preparing learners to speak with other English speakers, something like 80% of their interactions are with people who are not native speakers of English. So like our teaching needs to adjust to accommodate the fact that English is a lingua franca and a global language and everyone has ownership over it. And also, I think we've mentioned this before, Anna, or at least I know I've said this to you. Like, we need to put the onus on the listener more. So like this, people shouldn't feel the need to change, their linguistic identity to be comprehensible. Like that's one thing, right? But to do it so that there isn't an uprising about their linguistic identity, and even, having these talks come up.
I remember seeing that reel that Mary's referring to and getting incensed. I think that's exactly to your point, Shay, especially in the United States, but also other countries where English is the dominant language. It's very common for speakers to just feel ownership over that language, that people should speak like them and then not practice their listening skills to understand other ways of speaking English, whether it's something related to pronunciation or ways of speaking and more broadly.
Which is why we speak about privilege when we're talking about that, right? Because when you have never had to accommodate anyone else's way of understanding you, and you always think that other people should speak like you so that you will understand them, that's privilege.
Yeah, it's a pervasive problem.
I want to pause here for a moment, Anna, and share some of our listener contributions on this topic. We're not the only ones feeling angry about this.
Oh, no. We asked our audience how they've seen native speaker bias play out in ELT. And let's just say no one said they haven't seen it play out.
Right. Friend of the podcast, Anya Burt, said, "There's a constant lack of trust in non-native speakers or educators' ability to teach the language to others." She said she's seen more prejudice towards a teacher with a more prominent accent compared to another teacher from the same linguistic background but with a less pronounced accent.
So essentially, the more you can disguise yourself, your linguistic identity, the more trust you receive. That's despicable.
I agree. Anya added that people think that when they tell you, "Oh, I can barely hear your accent," it's a compliment, but it makes her cringe.
Of course, it's like assimilating to the standard accent is the way to acceptance. We can't tolerate this erasure.
And Kristen shared with us on Blue Sky that she had a student teacher who failed a practicum because her associate teacher thought she couldn't teach English with an accent. She was actually repeating her practicum with Kristen, and Kristen said she was one of the best student teachers she's ever worked with.
Again, we see this incorrect correlation between accent and competence as an educator. It's pretty infuriating, to be honest, since everyone has an accent. There's no such thing as an unaccented English.
That's right. It's all just carryover from colonial thinking and yet another attempt to keep people down.
There's one more audience response I want to bring up from friend of the podcast, Dustin of Sandman Stories Presents. He mentions that he noticed bias against multilingual teachers while he was teaching EFL in Korea and here in the States, with native Spanish speakers teaching English. He said these multilingual teachers deserve respect and that he doesn't know if people realize how hard it is to try to teach in a second or other language.
What makes me especially angry, Anna, is that most of the people who lodge these complaints are monolingual individuals and have never even tried to operate in another language, let alone teach one of their additional languages. Like, first of all, you sound ignorant. And secondly, show some respect. I'm with you, Dustin.
Yes. Thanks, Dustin. Thanks to our fantastic audience of impassioned teachers willing to share their thoughts with our community. You're just the best.
Yeah, so all of these issues that we have brought up so far, especially the fact that this is, we have to be in it for the long haul, right? It is tiring, but somebody needs to continue to fight to ensure that there is equality and equity in hiring practices and otherwise, and also just like being appreciative of people of different origins. I don't understand what the issue is, but there's a larger system at work. So let's talk about how we can challenge the systemic biases that exist in ELT. And I think that you have, your masterclass, maybe you have a personal framework that you want to use or share for defeating systemic bias in ELT. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So the masterclass is, I say masterclass because it's a 3-part masterclass. Started as like something live, because I used to do like webinars that were once a month talking about native speakerism in general. But then I thought, actually, one of the people who was participating said, there's like too much to digest here. There's too much going, like a bit like our conversation. It's really impossible to narrow things down and to, digest the quantity of information that comes with it. Because when you're talking about systemic bias and native speakerism, you really touch upon so many topics, because when you talk about accents, for instance, you talk about identity. And then you talk about like what comes with the accent and your identity and how you see yourself. So it goes really deep. It's like mindfulness and how you see yourself and the perceptions of others of you and so on and so forth. So when the person said this, I said, yes, it totally makes sense. But how do I kind of create a framework around this that everyone can benefit from? And I was specifically thinking about teachers. And then I thought, especially I'm based in Italy, a lot of Italian teachers have this problem of wanting to sound British. And a lot of them have like a British RP kind of pronunciation, which still sounds very unnatural or almost forced. And others tend to not speak in English outside of their classrooms because they're afraid of being judged for having an accent. And therefore, in secondary education, especially like in Spain, I've recently learned, there's always this like mother tongue teacher that comes along, and the backpacker we spoke about earlier. That's kind of the model of pronunciation. They have this very old kind of concept of someone who's helping out the actual teacher. And so, this is how we downplay teachers sometimes in the classroom, because if you bring along someone to aid the professional in the room and say that this is the model of pronunciation, not your own teacher who's gone through those 10,000 hours of training, I think you're already sending the wrong signal to a lot of students. First of all, they also understand that they will never be like that specific model because they will never be born in an English-speaking context or country. And then the message that you're sending the teacher is that their way of speaking is wrong. And the learners are seeing that themselves. And so like, okay, so my teacher doesn't know how to speak English. Clearly, she needs someone to help her. And look, the colonizer has gone. Like, this is how outdated these practices are. Like I'm laughing at this because I imagine myself, I'm just about to get into that kind of role because I'm waiting for, to be habilitated to work in secondary schools in the Italian system, in the public system. And it's a whole other episode, I promise you that. But I think like if I go through that, I will also get an assistant who is mother tongue, and he or she will probably be there once a week to show a good model of, and I think I might just lose my mind if they say this to me. I'm like, excuse me, what? Who's coming to help me?
Yeah.
Bringing in that prestige version of English.
Yeah.
But what's worse is that you're also giving the message to the colonizer native speaker coming into the classroom that they are a vital resource, and they actually believe it, because what we as non-native teachers have internalized negative self-talk and belief, we have that because of what we see and what is being perpetuated. They have the opposite. So when they have almost zero to no skills, they still think that as long as they open their mouths to speak, people are learning from them, and the proximity of them is what gives it. It's insane, but I trust
it's true, and it's so dangerous.
It's so dangerous. So this is what I mean by we need to speak about accent and models. And so in the first masterclass, that's all I talk about. So the journey of an accent, how everyone has an accent. And it really goes deep because, it comes with a workbook, and then you do the whole reflective processes because you really need the mindset to then tackle on what's coming next, which is methodologies. You learn about the approaches. You learn about the historical context of why certain methodologies and approaches were developed in the first place and how they are wrong, or it was okay to use them back when, but it's not okay to use them today, and why it isn't, and which ones could actually cater to, or how you can adapt them. I'm not saying invent a new approach, but have the conscience of knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it, and what is your prerogative and what is the objective of actually doing the thing that you're doing. So it's like 100 years of methodologies.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's why that's the second masterclass.
That's just part 2, right? Okay.
That's a lot of work for you. Yeah.
I can see why it wasn't working as a webinar, right?
Yeah, because I had to unpack all this. And so the third part then was finally teaching global pronunciation. And I go into like how I would go about it as a multilingual speaker, catering to multilingual learners, and how I would teach pronunciation, because that's something that non-native teachers often either they're told not to do or they don't want to do because they don't feel like they're that's why the part 1 and 2 really help with then tackling that third step of actually going out and teaching. And it comes with like 15 lessons already made, packaged, but editable, depending on the context and everything. And it's just to give that push, because then all the lessons have a kind of a similar topic, which is they try to defeat systemic bias within. So there's like this intricate system of, while you're teaching pronunciation, you're actually teaching people about the problem. So it's like a Trojan horse kind of pronunciation activity.
Yeah. So many layers to peel back. And I really appreciate the methodical way that you kind of go through this reflective process leading to very kind of concrete outcomes.
I'm wondering, when you get to the third part of your masterclass, are you using any resources to support teachers in learning how to teach global English?
I go through the IPA chart, and then I talk about what parts I would focus on and not focus on. For example, I'm totally against using minimal pair activities or things like that for learners, which is very challenging in a sense that a lot of people are all about that. And I see a lot of resources, even current ones, that are being developed on that. I don't think that it serves the learner as much because, I often speak about like, there are so many different things that can come in the way of intelligible, good pronunciation. It's all about why you are doing the things that you're doing. And also how can you adapt it in a way. Say you have a speech impediment, it's going to be the same. So a lot of native speakers, for instance, cannot pronounce or don't pronounce things correctly, but they are not made to feel like there's something lacking or that they will never have the skill of sounding or other people understanding them, right? Or like the ED endings. Why do we focus so much on things that really are unnecessary? And then like the vowels instead, or the vowel sounds that you actually should prioritize, and you should prioritize them, because in actual fact, when I was doing my research on this, I thought there are very few things that cause miscomprehension and communication breakdown, like very few. And those that occur within the native speaker group as well, if not even more sometimes, because they are used to hearing certain things and they have very little exposure to other accents. And so we really need to think about what is causing communication breakdown after all. Is it in fact bad pronunciation?
It's probably a vowel. Vowels are like the bane of our existence, right? As English language teachers.
But you see, you find a lot of teachers, they do these webinars of pronunciation, and what they end up doing is becoming learners again. And there they are trying to test themselves. Would I say this correctly? There we go again. Let's go back to step 1 again. You are the teacher now. So I help teachers see that they are the model of pronunciation. And because I'll say this, it's really easy to take your shot at a non-native teacher when they do something wrong or say something that might sound wrong, because it's like in your face wrong, right? But what I find a paradox is that when native speakers make mistakes, they're not maybe so in your face, but it's the pedagogy that's missing. It's the actual teaching that is missing, which is far worse than any pronunciation mistake on the surface level of any non-native teacher. I would say that.
That right there is the sentiment. Yes, and all of these methodologies that you're talking about, kind of deconstructing, that's what's taught. I mean, even at the master's level, I remember taking phonetics, phonology, and then talking about how would I teach this? And we're talking about minimal pairs.
Minimal pairs.
Yeah.
Such a big thing.
And it's so ingrained in our system for forming new teachers. You know, even if you have the credential has taught you these systemic biases through the way that it's presented to pre-service teachers.
We love the lingo, I guess. We love that, oh, this is such a big thing. It's a trending topic. And I guess course books sell when they have that. But as someone who is Delta qualified and with an MA, and I look at the course book and it's that, I'm like, this is not a priority. I'm not going into this with, an elementary class or fifth graders who can't even say, my name is, and I'm now going to say, there's a E and E. What am I doing here? And it's just so wrong on so many different levels.
I appreciate that Meri's approach focuses on intelligibility over perfection. We spend so much time drilling things like ship and sheep, but in real life, context does most of the work for us, right? Nobody's actually confused about whether their friend is getting on a boat or describing a woolly animal.
Right. We need to be asking who benefits from these pronunciation standards and who is being left behind because of them.
Let's hear Meri's final thoughts and her hopes for the future of English language teaching as a field.
I think I could summarize this with, we really prioritize qualifications and the effort that people put into getting better at what they do, and never thinking that you could be born into a skill or inherently possess a skill just because of XYZ factor that is outside of actually seeking out knowledge, I just want it to be fair in terms of, because it wouldn't make sense to me if I think that my children won't have the future that they want, or they couldn't do the things that they want to do in life just because they were born in the wrong place. It's just wrong. Any skill that you have, like with any subject that you're learning, you can't just say you are good at it without having invested those hours and those months and those learning. It's an occupation. It's not something that you might be lucky enough to find yourself in a position of, oh, I'm a teacher, I actually like this job, etc., etc. But so my wish for this industry is that you could finally understand that teaching English is an occupation. It's a job just like anything else. Just like you wouldn't say, you're a yoga instructor just because you've taken some yoga lessons, or just you are, a pilot because you've flown in a plane a couple of times. I wish for I wish for people to see it as a serious job, not something that just out of like proximity to native speakers or just out of having a conversation. And we know that you can learn languages inductively. That's not the point. It's the point that are you aware of the fact that you're learning through conversation with someone who is not a skilled teacher, or are we just all professors of the languages we speak since birth? We are not. It's a profession.
Right. That's right.
That's what I wish for ELT to kind of realize and stop perpetuating this myth, because it's actually, they're gatekeeping. They want to have this privilege, and they're really fighting to keep it.
Powerful stuff. I love that Meri highlights that proximity to a language doesn't make you a capable teacher, just like being a passenger in an airplane doesn't make you a pilot. Very true.
Yes, she brought up a lot of great points in this conversation. So let's wrap up with a little reflection to address the different stakeholders in the field, because every one of us plays an important part in dismantling the system, right?
Sure, yeah. So if you're listening to this and you're in a hiring position, How are you evaluating candidates? Are you prioritizing fluency over pedagogical knowledge? Being in a position of power comes with responsibility. How are you challenging your own biases?
And for teacher trainers, how are you ensuring you're not passing your biases along to the teacher trainees you're working with? How are you debunking the myth that any version of English is better than another?
And of course, for classroom teachers and independent tutors, what messages are you sending to students about their own English? Are you reinforcing the idea that some varieties of English are better than others? How can you move away from this hierarchical framework and ensure you're making learners feel valued in their linguistic identity?
Thanks so much to Meri for this insightful conversation. We're feeling empowered to use our platform in the name of equity for global English teachers.
Absolutely. Listeners, if you want to go deeper into this and related themes, we have linked to, a bunch of episodes in our show notes for you. In previous episodes, we've talked about advocacy and supporting multilingual teachers. We've looked at what representation means from an instructional perspective and examined how to address the connection between language and power in the English language classroom.
That's right. We hope you'll continue to reflect on these important ideas with us.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. Until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.